Picture this, your daughter's wedding day. White roses blooming in your backyard. Family and friends gathered under an oak tree, where she used to swing as a child. The minister is speaking. Your daughter is radiant in her grandmother's vintage lace dress. And then you hear a gunshot that shatters everything, that the HOA president just shot your daughter at her own wedding because she couldn't stand seeing a black family celebrating in her neighborhood. She thought she was untouchable. She thought her position as HOA president gave her power. She had no idea who she was dealing with. She didn't know I'm the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and she was about to learn that attacking my family would cost her absolutely everything. This is the story of how I systematically destroyed the life of a racist HOA Karen who tried to murder my daughter on the happiest day of her life. And trust me, by the time I was finished with her, she wished she'd never even heard our name. The morning sun painted golden streaks across our garden as I watched my daughter Emma fix her veil in the mirror. 25 years old, absolutely radiant, and about to marry the love of her life. After serving as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court for over 2 decades, after making countless difficult decisions and presiding over cases that shaped our nation's laws, nothing in my distinguished career compared to the overwhelming pride I felt in that moment. Dad, stop crying already, Emma laughed, reaching up to adjust my tie with gentle fingers. You're supposed to be the strong one here. Mom's already gone through half a box of tissues. I wiped my eyes and smiled, my mind flooding with memories. Emma, as a newborn, so small and perfect. Emma, as a toddler, standing up to kids twice her size when they picked on smaller children. Emma in high school, organizing protests against unfair school policies. Emma in college, studying social work because she wanted to help people who couldn't help themselves. Sorry, sweetheart, I managed to say. It's just hard to believe my baby is getting married. It feels like yesterday you were 6 years old, insisting on wearing your princess dress to the grocery store. Emma's eyes sparkled with tears of her own. And you let me, even though people stared. You always said I should be proud of who I am and never let anyone make me feel small. Those words would come back to haunt me later that day, when someone tried to make her feel not just small, but extinguished. Our house in Maple Grove was absolutely perfect for an outdoor ceremony. We'd moved here 15 years ago when I was first appointed to the state Supreme Court, and later when I became Chief Justice. Emma had always dreamed of getting married right here, in our backyard, under that old oak tree where she'd spent countless childhood afternoons on the swing. I'd built for her. My wife Sarah had worked magic with the space. The white roses she'd planted years ago were in full bloom, their petals perfect and pristine. Chairs sat in neat rows on the emerald lawn. A beautiful wooden arch stood ready for the ceremony, decorated with ribbons and flowers that perfectly matched Emma's bouquet. The neighborhood had initially welcomed us with open arms. Most of our neighbors were professional families who seemed to appreciate having a respected judge living among them. We attended block parties, contributed to community projects, and Sarah had even served on the school board for several years. We thought we'd found our forever home, a place where our family truly belonged. But there was a problem that had been growing, like a cancer beneath the surface for months. Her name was Margaret Henderson, and she was the president of our homeowners association. And she was absolutely violently furious about our wedding plans. Margaret was a woman in her early 50s with sharp, angular features and an even sharper tongue. She'd moved to Maple Grove about 5 years after us and had immediately begun inserting herself into every aspect of neighborhood politics. Within 2 years, she'd gotten herself elected as HOA president, running on a platform of maintaining property values and community standards. Those code words revealed their true meaning over time. Margaret had a serious problem with anyone who didn't look exactly like her or live precisely the way she thought they should. And our family, a successful black family who had the audacity to celebrate openly in her neighborhood, represented everything she despised. The trouble started 3 months before the wedding, when we submitted our application for the outdoor ceremony. We'd done everything by the book. All the paperwork was properly filed, every fee was paid, and we'd personally visited every neighbor within 2 blocks to discuss our plans and invite them to attend. We thought we were being good neighbors, considerate and thorough. Margaret showed up at our door the very next evening, her face twisted with barely controlled rage. "Justice Williams," she said, her voice dripping with fake politeness that couldn't quite mask her anger. "I'm sure you understand that Maple Grove has certain standards to maintain. A large wedding with music, catering trucks, and guests until midnight simply isn't acceptable for a residential neighborhood." I kept my voice calm and respectful, the way I always did when dealing with difficult people. Years on the bench had taught me patience. "Mrs. Henderson, we've followed all the proper procedures. The event is well within city guidelines. We have all necessary permits, and we've notified all neighbors personally. The music will end at 10 p.m., and we've hired professional security to manage parking and noise." Her face turned an alarming shade of red. "I don't care about your guidelines. I am the HOA president, and I say no loud parties in this neighborhood. People like you think you can do whatever you want just because of your position. This is a respectable community, not some inner-city party zone. People like you, inner-city party zone." The racist undertones weren't even undertones, they were blatant, ugly, and unmistakable. I'd dealt with this kind of prejudice throughout my entire career. As one of only 3 black chief justices in the entire country, I'd faced discrimination from lawyers who questioned my qualifications, politicians who tried to undermine my authority, and citizens who couldn't see past the color of my skin to recognize my achievements. I'd graduated top of my class from Harvard Law. I'd served with distinction in lower courts for 15 years. I'd written landmark decisions that were taught in law schools across the nation, but none of that mattered to people. Like Margaret Henderson, to her, I was just another black person who didn't belong in her precious neighborhood. Mrs. Henderson, I replied carefully, choosing each word with precision. I think there's been a misunderstanding. This is simply a wedding celebration for my daughter. We're not asking for anything that isn't allowed under community rules and city ordinances. But Margaret wasn't listening. She launched into a tirade about property values, neighborhood reputation, and how certain people always tried to push boundaries and change the character of established communities. The racism in her words was thinly veiled at best, completely transparent at worst. What followed were 3 months of systematic harassment that would make anyone's blood boil. Margaret sent letters to every neighbor, warning them about the disruptive event we were planning. She called the police multiple times with noise complaints during our setup, even though we were working during normal daytime hours and well within legal limits. She even tried to get the city to revoke our event permit, claiming we'd provided false information on our application to claim. That was quickly dismissed when the city reviewed our thorough documentation. Emma was devastated by Margaret's campaign. My strong, brave daughter, who had never backed down from injustice, started having anxiety dreams about her wedding day. She worried that guests wouldn't come because they were afraid of confrontation. She even suggested scaling back the celebration to avoid giving Margaret any ammunition for complaints. One evening, after Margaret had confronted Emma at the mailbox, demanding to know why she couldn't get married somewhere more appropriate, my daughter came home in tears. "Dad, maybe we should just move the wedding to a hotel," she suggested, her voice small and defeated. "I don't want to cause problems. I don't want to give her any more reasons to hate us." I took her hands in mine and looked her straight in the eyes. "Absolutely not," I said firmly. "This is our home. This is where you grew up, where you took your first steps, where you learned to ride a bike. This is where your grandparents visited every Christmas. No one, and I mean no one, has the right to take this day away from you." But I could see that Margaret's harassment had taken its toll. The light in Emma's eyes had dimmed. Her excitement had been replaced with anxiety, and I felt a cold fury building inside me that I'd never experienced before, not in all my years of dealing with criminals and injustice in the courtroom. I had spent 30 years fighting injustice in courtrooms across the country. I wasn't about to let a bigoted HOA president destroy my daughter's happiness. The morning of the wedding arrived with perfect weather. The sun shone bright, a gentle breeze kept everyone comfortable, and our backyard looked absolutely magical. Guests began arriving around 1 p.m. for the 2:30 ceremony, and I tried my best to push thoughts of Margaret Henderson completely out of my mind. This was Emma's day, and nothing was going to ruin it. My wife Sarah looked absolutely stunning in her navy silk dress, greeting guests with the warm smile that had made me fall in love with her 30 years ago. She directed traffic with practiced ease, making sure elderly relatives had comfortable seats in the shade and helping parents corral excited children. Emma's future mother, Mrs. Chin, helped arrange flowers and made sure the bridal party had everything they needed. David's family had embraced Emma completely, treating her like the daughter they'd always wanted. His younger sister served as a bridesmaid alongside Emma's college roommates. The afternoon felt perfect. Laughter and conversation filled our backyard. Emma's college friends shared embarrassing stories about her dating life before. David, my law school buddies, congratulated me on raising such a remarkable daughter. Sarah's book club members raved about the decorations and the delicious appetizers our caterer had prepared. And then I saw her. Margaret Henderson stood at the very edge of our property line, arms crossed over her chest, wearing all black like she was attending a funeral instead of a wedding. Her face was set in hard lines of disapproval, and she stared at our celebration with undisguised hatred. Her husband Harold stood behind her, shifting uncomfortably and looking like he desperately wanted to be anywhere else in the world. Margaret had been watching our preparations all morning from her house directly across the street. She'd positioned herself in her front yard with a clipboard, taking notes and photographing everything with a long lens camera. When the catering truck arrived, she'd rushed over to check if it was properly licensed. When the musicians began setting up, she'd called the police to complain about noise violations, even though they were only doing sound checks. "Ignore her, honey," Sarah whispered, taking my arm as she noticed my jaw clenching. "Today is about Emma and David. Don't let that woman steal any more of our joy." But I could see Margaret's presence was affecting our guests. Some people kept glancing nervously in her direction. The musicians looked uncomfortable. Even the minister asked me quietly if there might be any disruptions during the ceremony. I assured him everything would be fine. I was wrong. The ceremony began at 2:30 sharp. Emma appeared at the back door of our house, and every single conversation stopped. She was absolutely breathtaking in her grandmother's vintage wedding dress, the same dress Sarah had spent months carefully altering to fit Emma perfectly. The lace had been preserved for 40 years. Waiting for exactly this moment, Emma walked down the aisle on my arm, radiant with happiness despite everything Margaret Henderson had put her through. Her fiancé David waited at the altar with tears of joy streaming down his face. David was a good man, a pediatric nurse who had met Emma when she was volunteering at the children's hospital. He was gentle, kind, and absolutely devoted to my daughter. The minister began the service with a prayer for love, commitment, and understanding. For a few precious minutes, everything was absolutely perfect. Emma and David exchanged vows they'd written themselves, promising to support each other's dreams, to be patient with each other's flaws, and to build a family based on love and respect. Their words were beautiful, heartfelt, and genuine. I felt tears streaming down my face as I listened to my daughter promise her life to this wonderful man. Sarah squeezed my hand, and I could feel her trembling with emotion beside me. And that's when Margaret Henderson made her move. "This is a violation of community standards," she screamed from the property line, her voice cutting through the gentle afternoon air like a knife. "I'm calling the police right now. This illegal gathering ends today." A few guests turned to look, their faces showing confusion and concern. But the minister, bless his heart, continued the ceremony without missing a beat. He'd been briefed about the possibility of disruption, and he handled it with grace and professionalism. Emma squeezed my hand and smiled bravely. "We expected this, Dad," she whispered. "Don't let her win." I was so incredibly proud of my daughter's courage, even with Margaret Henderson screaming threats in the background. Emma kept her focus on David and their commitment to each other. She refused to let hatred interrupt this sacred moment, but Margaret wasn't finished. Making a spectacle of herself, she stormed across the street to her house, her black dress flowing behind her like a dark cloud. Harold followed, apparently trying to talk her out of whatever she was planning. I watched them disappear into their house, hoping that maybe, just maybe, someone had finally talked some sense into her. 5 minutes later, Margaret returned. What I saw in her hands made my blood run cold. Margaret Henderson was carrying a rifle. It was a hunting rifle, the kind used for deer hunting, and she was carrying it with the confidence of someone who knew exactly how to use it. The weapon looked enormous, black metal gleaming in the afternoon sunlight as she raised it above her head. "Everyone needs to leave now," she shouted, waving the weapon in the air. "This illegal gathering ends today. I warned you people, and you wouldn't listen." Panic rippled through the crowd like wildfire. Some guests ducked behind the white wooden chairs. Others grabbed their children and started running toward the house. Mrs. Chin screamed and fell to her knees. The musicians dropped their instruments and dove for cover behind their equipment. The minister stopped speaking mid-sentence and stepped back from the altar, his face pale with terror. David instinctively moved in front of Emma, shielding her with his body. "Mrs. Henderson, put the gun down," I called out, my voice steady despite my racing heart and the adrenaline flooding my system. "Let's talk about this calmly. There's no need for weapons." But Margaret was beyond reason. Her face was twisted with rage and something else, a kind of manic satisfaction that she finally had everyone's attention. She kept the rifle pointed toward the ceremony area, sweeping it back and forth across the crowd of terrified people. "I warned you people months ago," she screamed, her voice breaking with emotion. "I told you this neighborhood has standards. You think because you're some big-shot judge, you can ignore the rules. You think you can bring your loud music and your crowds and ruin our peaceful community?" Harold appeared behind her, reaching for the gun. "Margaret, please put it down. You're scaring people. This has gone too far." She spun around and pointed the rifle directly at her own husband. "Don't you dare touch me. I'm tired of everyone in this neighborhood walking all over me. I'm tired of being ignored and disrespected." Emma and David stood frozen at the altar, still in their wedding poses, but now surrounded by absolute chaos and terror. I could see the fear in my daughter's eyes, but also her characteristic determination. Emma had inherited my stubborn streak, and she wasn't going to let this woman destroy her wedding day without trying to reason with her. "Please, Mrs. Henderson," Emma called out, her voice shaking but clear and brave. "This is just a wedding. We're celebrating love and family. We're not hurting anyone. Can't you please just let us have this one day?" That's when everything went horribly, tragically wrong. Margaret swung the rifle toward Emma, her finger moving to the trigger. The weapon was now pointed directly at my daughter's chest. "Shut up," Margaret screamed, her face contorted with pure hatred. "You and your family are ruining this neighborhood. You don't belong here. None of you belong here." Time seemed to slow down, like in a nightmare where you're trying to run, but your legs won't move. I saw Margaret's finger tighten on the trigger. I saw Emma standing there in her white dress, beautiful and innocent and perfect. I saw my wife Sarah screaming my name from somewhere behind me. I saw David trying desperately to push Emma out of the way, and then I heard the gunshot. The sound was absolutely deafening. echoing off the houses around us like thunder. Birds exploded from nearby trees. Car alarms started going off on the street. Emma crumpled to the ground. Red spread across the white fabric of her grandmother's precious dress, like spilled wine, staining the lace that had been so carefully preserved for this moment. David dropped to his knees beside her, pressing his hands against the wound in her shoulder, his white shirt quickly soaking with blood. Emma, Emma. I ran toward my daughter, but Sarah reached her first, falling to her knees and cradling Emma's head in her lap. The yard erupted in complete chaos. Guests were screaming and running in all directions. Someone tackled Margaret and wrestled the gun away from Hai. Later learned it was David's father, a Vietnam veteran who had recognized the danger immediately and acted with the training that had never left him. Harold Henderson was on his knees, sobbing and apologizing over and over, as if his words could somehow undo what his wife had just done. I could hear sirens in the distance, growing louder by the second. Someone had called 911, probably multiple people, but all I could focus on was my little girl lying on the ground in her wedding dress, blood soaking through the delicate lace that had been preserved for 40 years for this special day. "Dad," she whispered as I knelt beside her, taking her hand in mine. Her skin felt cold and clammy. I'm sorry the wedding is ruined. I'm sorry I couldn't be stronger." Tears streamed down my face as I held her hand, trying to stay calm for her, even though my heart was breaking. "Don't you dare apologize, sweetheart. You did nothing wrong, nothing. You were perfect and brave and beautiful." Emma tried to smile, but I could see the pain and shock in her eyes. "Am I going to die, Dad?" "No," I said firmly, squeezing her hand. "No, you're not going to die. You're going to be fine. The doctors are going to take care of you, and you're going to have a beautiful life with David." But inside, I was terrified. There was so much blood, and Emma was getting paler by the minute, her breathing shallow and rapid. The paramedics arrived within 8 minutes, 8 minutes that felt like 8 hours. They immediately took over Emma's care, starting an IV, applying pressure bandages, and loading her into an ambulance with efficient, practiced movements. Sarah and I rode with her to the hospital while David followed in his car, still wearing his blood-stained tuxedo. The emergency room became a blur of activity. Doctors and nurses rushed Emma into surgery while we filled out paperwork and answered questions in a fog of shock and terror. David's family arrived, along with my brother and Sarah's parents. We all sat in the waiting room, still wearing our wedding clothes, holding each other and praying. The next 8 hours were the longest of my life. Emma was in surgery, and the doctors couldn't tell us if there would be permanent damage. The bullet had shattered her collarbone, torn through muscles, and damaged nerves. They warned us she might never regain full use of her right arm. Margaret Henderson had been arrested at the scene and charged with aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, reckless endangerment, and terroristic threatening. But as I sat in that hospital waiting room, staring at my hands that were still stained with my daughter's blood, listening to my wife cry, I knew those charges weren't nearly enough. My daughter's wedding day had been destroyed. Her body had been damaged. Her dreams of a perfect celebration in her childhood home had been shattered by hatred and bigotry. Margaret Henderson had no idea that she had just made an enemy of the most powerful judge in the country. Emma survived the surgery, thank God, but the damage was extensive. The bullet had shattered her collarbone and damaged the nerves in her right arm. The doctors said she would need months of physical therapy, and they weren't sure if she would ever regain full mobility. David never left her side. During the 2 weeks she spent in the hospital, he learned to help her eat, brush her teeth, and get dressed. He was patient and gentle and loving, and their bond only grew stronger through the trauma. Watching them together, I saw that their love was real and deep and would survive anything. But Emma wasn't the same person who had laughed at my tears that morning. The bright, confident young woman who had stood up to bullies her entire life was gone, replaced by someone who jumped at sudden noises, had nightmares about gunshots, and couldn't bear to talk about having another wedding ceremony. "I just want to forget it ever happened, Dad," she told me one evening, staring out the hospital window at the parking lot below. "I want to pretend none of this is real. I want to go back to the way things were before." That's when I knew exactly what I had to do. Margaret Henderson was going to pay for what she'd done, not just with prison time, but with everything she had. I was going to use every connection, every favor, every ounce of influence I'd built over 30 years in the legal system. I was going to destroy her completely. Margaret Henderson's case came up for preliminary hearings 2 weeks after the shooting. Her lawyer, a public defender named Robert Mills, was trying to get the charges reduced to simple assault. He claimed Margaret had been defending her property and had only meant to fire a warning shot that accidentally struck Emma. Margaret and her lawyer didn't know was that I had connections throughout the entire legal system, judges who owed me favors from years of collaboration, prosecutors who respected my opinion and valued my endorsement, police officers who had worked with me on criminal justice, reform initiatives. I started making phone calls. The first call was to District Attorney Patricia Morris, an old friend from law school who had worked her way up through the prosecutor's office over 20 years. Patricia, I need to ask you a personal favor, I said, sitting in my home office surrounded by law books and family photos, including one of Emma at her high school graduation, smiling and full of hope. Anything, Robert, how is Emma doing? We've all been thinking about your family. She's alive, but she'll never be the same. The physical damage is bad enough, but the emotional trauma. I took a deep breath. Patricia, I need you to throw the full weight of your office behind this case. Margaret Henderson didn't fire a warning shot. She tried to murder my daughter on her wedding day because she couldn't stand the idea of a black family celebrating in her neighborhood. There was silence on the other end of the line. Patricia knew what I was asking. As Chief Justice, I rarely got involved in local criminal cases. My job was to oversee the appeals process, not influence prosecutions. But this was personal. This was my daughter. Consider it done. Robert, she said finally, we'll make sure Henderson faces every possible charge. I'll put my best prosecutors on the case. The next call was to Judge Harrison Blake. Who would be handling Henderson's case? Harrison, I'm calling about the Henderson shooting case. Robert, you know I can't discuss pending cases with you. It would be inappropriate. I'm not asking you to discuss it. I'm telling you that this woman shot an innocent girl at her own wedding because of racial prejudice and HOA power trips. The evidence is clear. The witnesses are solid. Don't let her lawyer manipulate the system to get her a slap on the wrist. Judge Blake was quiet for a long moment. He had been appointed to the bench with my recommendation, and he knew his career could be influenced by my opinion. I understand your concern, Robert. Justice will be served according to the law. But my most important call was to Detective Maria Santos, who was investigating the case. Detective Santos, this is Chief Justice Williams. I want to make sure you have all the resources you need for the Henderson investigation. Yes, sir. We're building a strong case. We have multiple witnesses, video footage from security cameras, and physical evidence. But there's something else you should know. What's that? We found evidence that Margaret Henderson has been harassing other minority families in the neighborhood for years. Threatening letters, false police reports, property damage that was never properly investigated. We're looking into potential hate crime charges. My hands clenched into fists. Margaret Henderson wasn't just a woman who had lost control in a moment of anger. She was a predator who had been terrorizing families like mine for years, and no one had stopped her. Detective, I want you to interview every family she's harassed. Build a pattern of behavior. Show the court exactly what kind of person we're dealing with. Already on it, sir. We found at least 6 other families who have been targeted. The Martinez family had their car vandalized 3 times. The Johnsons received death threats in their mailbox. The Patels had their fence damaged and found racist graffiti on their garage. We're going to make sure she never hurts anyone else. Over the next several weeks, I used every connection I had built over 3 decades in the legal system. I called in favors, made recommendations, and ensured that Margaret Henderson's case received the full attention it deserved. The investigation expanded far beyond the wedding day shooting. Police discovered that Margaret had been running what amounted to a systematic harassment campaign against minority families in Maple Grove for over 5 years. She'd used her position as HOA president to intimidate, threaten, and terrorize anyone who didn't fit her narrow definition of acceptable neighbors. The pattern was clear and damning. She'd filed false police reports claiming suspicious activity whenever minority families had gatherings. She'd issued bogus HOA violations for minor infractions she ignored when white families did the same things. She'd spread rumors about property values declining because of those people moving in. Margaret Henderson had created an atmosphere of fear and hatred, all while hiding behind the respectable veneer of community standards and property values. The trial began 4 months after the shooting. Emma was strong enough to testify, though she still wore a sling and her right hand shook when she was nervous. She told the court about her wedding day, about the months of harassment leading up to it, about lying on the ground in her grandmother's dress, wondering if she was going to die. David testified about watching the woman he loved get shot on what should have been the happiest day of their lives. He described the helplessness he felt, the terror, the blood on his hands that he couldn't wash away for days. Sarah broke down on the stand, describing how it felt to hold her daughter's bleeding body, to see her baby girl's white dress turning red, to wonder if these would be Emma's last moments alive. The prosecution presented a devastating case. Video evidence from multiple security cameras showed Henderson crossing property lines with a loaded weapon, pointing it at innocent people, and deliberately aiming at Emma. Witness after witness testified about her racist comments and threats over the years. The pattern of harassment was undeniable, but the most damaging evidence came from Henderson's own mouth. During police questioning, she had said, "I was tired of these people thinking they could do whatever they wanted in our neighborhood. Someone had to take a stand and show them they don't belong here. These people, they don't belong here." The same racist language she had been using for years, now captured on police recordings and presented to the jury. Margaret Henderson's defense attorney tried to paint her as a concerned neighbor who had made a terrible mistake. He claimed she had been overwhelmed by stress from her recent divorce proceedings and had only meant to fire a warning shot to disperse the crowd, but the evidence was overwhelming. The ballistics report showed the gun had been aimed directly at Emma, not into the air. The witnesses were unanimous and clear about Henderson's intent. The pattern of harassment spoke to premeditation. Rather than a moment of panic, the jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. Guilty on all counts. Aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, reckless endangerment, terroristic threatening, and hate crime enhancements that doubled the potential sentence. When the verdict was read, Margaret Henderson collapsed in her chair, wailing about how her life was ruined. I watched from the gallery with no sympathy whatsoever. Her life was ruined because she had tried to ruin and nearly end my daughter's life. Her husband, Harold, who had stood by her throughout the investigation and trial, finally walked away. He filed for divorce the following week, citing irreconcilable differences and emotional cruelty. Even he couldn't defend her anymore. Margaret Henderson was sentenced to 15 years in prison without the possibility of parole for 8 years. The judge, Judge Harrison Blake, who understood exactly what kind of justice this case required, made it clear that her sentence reflected not just the shooting, but the years of racist harassment that had led up to it. You used your position of authority to terrorize innocent families, Judge Blake said from the bench. You created an atmosphere of fear and hatred in a neighborhood that should have been a safe haven for everyone. And when one family refused to be intimidated, you responded with violence. This court finds your actions reprehensible and deserving of the maximum sentence allowed by law. But the criminal trial was just the beginning of Margaret Henderson's troubles. The civil lawsuit came next. Emma and David sued for medical expenses, lost wages, pain and suffering, and emotional distress. Their lawyer was the best money could be a partner at the most prestigious firm in the state who owed me several favors from his early career when I'd mentored him through some difficult cases. The civil case was even more devastating than the criminal trial. Without the burden of proving guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, the lawyer was able to present extensive evidence of Henderson's years of harassment and the full extent of Emma's injuries. Medical experts testified about the permanent damage to Emma's shoulder and arm. Psychologists explained the PTSD, anxiety, and depression she would likely deal with for the rest of her life. Financial experts calculated the impact on her earning potential. Given her reduced mobility, the jury awarded Emma and David $2.3 million in damages. Margaret Henderson lost her house to pay the judgment. She lost her savings, her retirement accounts, and her late mother's inheritance. Everything she had ever worked for was gone, seized to compensate the woman whose life she had nearly destroyed. But I wasn't finished with my revenge. Using my connections throughout the legal community, I made sure that Margaret Henderson's story became known throughout the state and beyond. Legal journals wrote lengthy articles about the case, analyzing the intersection of HOA power, racism, and gun violence. Bar associations used it as a continuing education example of how prejudice and hatred could destroy lives. Henderson's employer, a small accounting firm where she had worked for 12 years, fired her when the negative publicity became too much for their business to handle. Her professional CPA license was suspended pending ethics reviews that would likely result in permanent revocation. She would never work in her field again. The Maple Grove HOA removed her as president and voted to dissolve the organization entirely rather than deal with the massive liability issues her actions had created. The neighborhood she had tried so hard to control wanted nothing to do with her or her legacy. Margaret Henderson went from being a woman who controlled her neighborhood with an iron fist to someone who couldn't find a job or a decent place to live. She moved in with her elderly mother in a different state. But even there, people knew her story. The internet never forgets. Margaret Henderson's face was forever associated with racism, violence, and hatred. Her mugshot appeared in news articles that would follow her for the rest of her life. Anyone who Googled her name would immediately find the story of what she had done. 8 months after the trial, I received a letter in my chambers at the courthouse. It was handwritten on cheap paper, and the return address showed it came from the Women's Correctional Facility where Margaret Henderson was serving her sentence. Justice Williams. It began in shaky handwriting. I know you will probably throw this letter away without reading it, but I need to try to apologize. I know what I did was wrong. I know I hurt your daughter and destroyed her special day. I was angry and scared, and I let my prejudices control my actions. I thought I was protecting my neighborhood, but I realize now that I was just protecting my own narrow-minded view of the world. I don't expect forgiveness, and I don't deserve it, but I wanted you to know that I am sorry. I have lost everything: my house, my job, my husband, my reputation, and I deserve it all. I just hope your daughter can find peace and happiness despite what I did to her. I read the letter 3 times, then locked it in my desk drawer next to other important documents. An apology couldn't give Emma back her perfect wedding day. It couldn't erase the nightmares, the physical therapy, the fear in her eyes when she heard sudden loud noises, or the limited mobility in her right arm that would last for the rest of her life. but it was acknowledgement. Margaret Henderson finally understood what her hatred had caused not just to Emma and our family, but to herself and everyone who had ever cared about her. Emma and David had a beautiful second wedding ceremony exactly 1 year after the shooting. Emma insisted it be held at our house again, in the same spot where she had been shot. "I won't let her take this place away from me, Dad," she said, as we planned the intimate event. "This is my home. This is where I belong. This is where I want to start my married life." Her shoulder had healed enough for her to wear a sleeveless dress, though she would always have limited mobility in her right arm and chronic pain on cold days. David had learned to help her with things she couldn't manage alone, and their love had only grown stronger through the trauma they had survived together. The ceremony was smaller this time, just close family and a few dear friends. But it was perfect in a way the first one never could have been. There was no fear, no anger, no hatred, just love and healing and hope for the future. As I walked Emma down the aisle for the second time, I thought about justice and revenge and the thin line between them. Justice was Margaret Henderson sitting in prison, paying her debt to society according to law. Revenge was making sure she lost everything else to her freedom, her reputation, her livelihood, her marriage, her home, her future. I had used my position and my connections to systematically destroy a woman who had tried to destroy my daughter. Some might say I had abused my power, that I had gone too far in my pursuit of vengeance. Others might say I had simply ensured that justice was truly served, that a dangerous racist who had terrorized innocent families finally faced real consequences for her actions. But as I watched Emma say her vows with tears of joy instead of pain, as I saw David promise to love and protect her for the rest of their lives, as I felt Sarah's hand squeeze mine with happiness instead of fear, I knew I had done the right thing. Margaret Henderson had shot my daughter on her wedding day, because she thought we were just another family she could intimidate and control with her position as HOA president. She had no idea I was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. She had no idea that attacking my family would bring down the full weight of the legal system on her head. She had no idea that her moment of racist violence would cost her everything she had ever cared about. But she knew now, and she would remember for the rest of her life. Sitting in her prison cell, thinking about the 15 years she would spend behind bars because she couldn't tolerate the sight of a black family celebrating love in their own backyard. Emma threw her bouquet, and the flowers sailed through the air toward her college roommates. David kissed his bride, and our small group of family and friends cheered with genuine joy. The sun was setting behind our house, painting the sky in brilliant shades of gold and pink dot. It was beautiful and peaceful and perfect. The ceremony ended, and we moved to the reception area, the same spot where chairs had been scattered and blood had stained the grass a year ago. But now there were only smiles and laughter and celebration. The minister who had been there for both ceremonies gave a touching blessing, acknowledging the journey this couple had been through and the strength of their love. During the reception, Emma pulled me aside for a private moment under the oak tree where she used to swing. "Dad, I need to tell you something," she said, taking my hand in her left one, her stronger one. "I know what you did. I know how you used your connections to make sure Margaret Henderson paid for what she did. I know some people might think you went too far." I started to respond, but she held up her hand. "I want you to know that I'm grateful," she continued, tears forming in her eyes. "Not because I wanted revenge, but because you made sure that woman can never hurt another family the way she hurt ours. You didn't just fight for me, you fought for every family she terrorized, and every family she might have terrorized in the future. That's not abuse of power. That's what justice is supposed to look like." I pulled my daughter into a gentle embrace, careful of her shoulder. "You're stronger than I ever was at your age," I whispered. "You survived something no one should have to survive, and you're still full of love and hope. That's the real victory." In the months following Margaret Henderson's conviction, Maple Grove changed dramatically. Without her toxic influence, the neighborhood became what it should have been all along, a genuine community. The families Margaret had harassed finally felt safe enough to speak up about their experiences. The Martinez family hosted a block party that celebrated their Mexican heritage with traditional food and music. The Johnsons organized a Juneteenth celebration that brought the entire neighborhood together. The Patels invited everyone to their Diwali festival, turning our street into a beautiful display of lights and culture. Our neighborhood became more diverse, more welcoming, more alive. Property values actually increased, because people wanted to live in a community that celebrated differences rather than punishing them. Sarah and I received dozens of thank you cards from families who had been suffering in silence under Margaret's reign of terror. Some of them had been planning to move away, unwilling to endure the harassment any longer. Now they were staying, raising their children in homes they loved, finally feeling like they belonged. Emma and David moved into a beautiful apartment not far from us. Despite her physical limitations, Emma returned to her work as a social worker, specializing in helping victims of violence and trauma. She turned her own experience into a source of strength and empathy for others. "I understand what it feels like to have someone try to take away your sense of safety," She told me during one of our weekly dinners. I know what it's like to feel powerless and afraid, and I know what it takes to rebuild your life after violence. If my experience can help even one person find their way through that darkness, then maybe something good came from it after all. David continued his work as a pediatric nurse, and together they talked about starting a family. Emma worried about whether she could physically handle caring for a baby with her limited mobility, but David was confident they would figure it out together. We've already survived the worst thing that could happen, he told her. Everything else is just details we'll work through. 2 years after the shooting, I was invited to speak at a national conference on hate crimes and community violence. I rarely accepted speaking engagements outside my official duties, but this one felt important. Standing at the podium, looking out at an audience of prosecutors, judges, victim advocates, and law enforcement officers, I told Emma's story. I talked about how hatred hiding behind community standards could escalate to violence. I talked about the importance of taking harassment seriously before it reaches a breaking point. I talked about the responsibility we all have to stand up against prejudice in our communities. Margaret Henderson didn't become a would-be murderer overnight. I told the audience, she spent years building up her hatred, normalizing her racism. Using her authority to hurt people she considered lesser than herself, and the system allowed it to continue because her actions seemed small and petty HOA violations, noise complaints, neighborhood disputes. No one connected the dots until she showed up at my daughter's wedding with a rifle. The speech was covered by legal publications and news outlets across the country. I received emails from judges and prosecutors who had similar cases in their jurisdictions. HOA officials using their power to harass minorities. Neighbors escalating disputes into violence. Community leaders hiding racism behind bureaucratic language. My daughter's tragedy became a catalyst for change. Several states passed laws specifically addressing harassment by HOA officials and creating stronger penalties for hate crimes involving community organizations. It wasn't enough to undo what happened to Emma, but it might prevent it from happening to someone else. Through my connections in the corrections system, I occasionally received updates about Margaret Henderson's status in prison. She was not adjusting well. In prison, Margaret's perceived authority meant nothing. Her racism made her enemies. Her sense of entitlement made her a target. She spent much of her time in protective custody. After several altercations with other inmates who didn't appreciate her attitude, she had aged dramatically, looking a decade older than her actual years. Her health was declining. She had no visitors. Harold had completely cut ties. Her few friends had abandoned her, and her elderly mother had passed away shortly after. Margaret's incarceration. Margaret Henderson was experiencing a tiny fraction of the isolation and powerlessness she had inflicted on others for years. Some might say I should feel compassion for her suffering. I didn't. I felt satisfaction that justice was being served every single day. She spent behind bars. On the 3rd anniversary of the shooting, our entire extended family gathered at our house for what had become an annual tradition, a celebration of survival, resilience, and love. Emma and David announced they were expecting their first child, a daughter they planned to name Hope. As Sarah and I stood in our backyard, watching our daughter laugh with her husband and surrounded by family who loved her, I reflected on everything that had happened. Was I wrong to use my influence to ensure Margaret Henderson received the maximum possible punishment? Some legal ethics scholars might argue I crossed a line, but I would do it again in a heartbeat. I didn't just protect my daughter, I protected every family Margaret Henderson might have terrorized in the future. I sent a message that racism, hiding behind authority and bureaucracy, would not be tolerated. I showed that even people in positions of power can be held accountable when they abuse that power to hurt others. Margaret Henderson thought she was untouchable because she was an HOA president in a wealthy neighborhood. She thought she could control who belonged and who didn't based on the color of their skin. She thought she could terrorize my family and face no real consequences. She was wrong. She spent months trying to destroy my daughter's happiness. In the end, she destroyed her own life instead. In sitting in that prison cell for the next 12 years, she would have plenty of time to think about the choices that brought her there. Emma's daughter, Hope, was born healthy and beautiful. David proved to be an amazing father, and Emma adapted to motherhood despite her physical limitations. They named me Hope's godfather, and I took that responsibility seriously. At Hope's christening, held once again in our backyard under that same oak tree, Emma gave a short speech. 3 years ago, someone tried to kill me in this exact spot because she hated what our family represented, she said, holding baby Hope in her arms. She wanted to silence us, to make us leave, to prove we didn't belong. But we're still here. We're still celebrating. We're still loving. And now we have this beautiful new life to add to our family. Hatred didn't win. Love did. I looked around at the diverse group of friends and family gathered in our backyard: black, white, Asian, Hispanic, young and old, from all walks of life. This was what Margaret Henderson had been so afraid of. This beautiful, messy, complicated celebration of human diversity and connection. and I smiled, knowing that while Margaret Henderson sat in a prison cell, my daughter was free to love, to celebrate, to build a family, to live her life without fear. That was the ultimate victory. Not the prison sentence, or the financial ruin, or the destroyed reputation, but the simple fact that Emma was still here, still strong, still full of hope despite everything that had happened to her. Margaret Henderson had tried to destroy my daughter's life. Instead, she destroyed her own. And that, I decided, was justice. If you enjoyed this story, please like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever dealt with an HOA nightmare? Let us know your experiences. And remember, hatred and prejudice have no place in our communities. Stand up, speak out, and never let bullies win.